Hi, I'm James Hughes, head guide at Schultz Outfitters, and I'm going to talk to you today about tying the Mini Fleein Cray. This is a fly that got started pretty much like a season after the original full-size version. The reason that I ended up downsizing it was because it was a more castable version than the full size for most people. Also, it allowed you to fish more of the season. You didn't need as much water to run this thing. Couple of things are different on this. Rather than having a hook in the front and a shank in the back, that's flip-flop. So we got the hook in the rear and the shank in the front. Couple little different things we had to change up to accommodate for this platform, but it has made a very effective fly for us year-round. Even if the water's high, low, doesn't matter. You can run this thing all the way through the real low water months of August and September. It doesn't dive as much as its predecessor. It'll give you more of a gliding swim. And with that, we will go ahead and jump into tying this. We're going to start by putting our Gammarus hook into the vise and laying down a nice thread base. Touching wraps, starting at the eye, going to the start of the bend, and then we're going to go ahead and work our way down the bend. I like to take this about midway down that bend, and then I'll go back to the top, get rid of that tag, and now we're going to put in our keel. For this keel, I'm using 030 lead, which has just kind of become my standard usage at this point. My pet peeve is having keels break and fall off, so I'm going to do a couple of things to ensure that that does not happen, or at least I can get as much life out of them as possible. Most of my flies, I'll see these keels stay on for 1 to 2 seasons, if not more. So with that thread now, at basically the very start of that bend, I'm going to lay that keel along the bend and wrap downward to where I finished my thread wraps earlier. Okay, so it's sitting there flush riding that bend. I'm then going to take that back up to the top, and I'm just going to get it out of the way for a minute. Once there, I'm going to take the lead and then wrap it around the bend in an upward direction. Tight touching wraps, trying to keep it nice, neat, and clean. Once I got it up, I didn't take it all the way up to the top. Don't need that huge of one here. But it looks like we got about, I don't know, 8 wraps or so of lead on there. Then I'm going to take that thread, work it back across the shank, down to the bottom and back up to the top, going right over the wraps of lead here. This is not going to be a super high finish product. We're just trying to lash that thing in, because we're also going to coat it with some Flex Seal here, this Raid Zap Flex, to ensure that's locked in. I like the Flex stuff because I don't think it cracks as often, especially after you've bounced it off a bridge piling, a rock, or a log. So when all's said and done, instead of this thing just sitting on there, you've got it tied in the first place, wrapped around the bend, and then lashed down again, as well as sealed in with the Flex resin. And if you show up with unkeeled flies on my boat, you won't fish them. Cool. With that successfully keeled, and that successfully goofed, there we go. I'm going to bring that thread right back to the back end of the actual shank there. And we're going to tie in our antenna, which will be this sexy floss. With this, you can kind of go nuts, and while it is antenna, that doesn't mean you only need 2. We're just going for a suggestion of antenna and legs and wiggly bits off the back. And when it comes to color, you can let your imagination run wild, kind of build a theme off of it if you want to. I like putting some bright stuff back there. We keep it long too because that will help act as a rudder, assisting the fly in turning while swimming. So I tied the span flex in at about its midpoint and doubled it over, which gives me about a 3 to 4 inches of hang off the back. So we started with yellow. I'm going to mix in some brown. Again, doubling it over, tying it in the middle. And then something I always finish off with is a couple of strands of red. With the red, I like to keep them, at least 2 of them, running just a little longer than everything else. And instead of just trimming off the short ends, I'll just go ahead and double them in and add to that rubbery mass in the back. And then here I'm going to add some super glue to make sure everything locks in real nice. Alright, our next step, we're going to make a little bit of a bump back here using Frenzy Fly brush in order to help prop up the claws when we tie those in. So I'm tying that Frenzy brush in right where I finished with the antenna. And you don't need a lot of wraps of this. About 2 to 3 will do. With these brushes, it's very important after each wrap or half wrap to train those materials back. A wire brush can really help with that. We're going to get ready to tie in our claws. These claws don't need to hang super far back. Alright, it's more a suggestion than anything. So these lengths I have here, they're probably about a couple inches or so. These will be perfectly fine. And we're tying them in directly on the side of the hook shank, and I will rotate this in a minute to show you exactly what I mean. And then once they're in, adding some super glue. So this is what I mean here. Each one coming right off the side of that hook shank, so they sit just like a crawdad. This being the ultimate goal here. Next I'm going to tie in the lively leg brush. And we are going to glue that in as well. And with this will just fill in the body of this thing before we cap it off and move to the next step. Again, with this brush, each and every step, you should be taking the time to work the fiber and the rubber legs back. These wraps don't need to be super close together. I'm leaving just a little bit of space between them. An important thing with this, don't crowd the hook eye. Stop before you think you want to. because you got one more step before we move on. We're going to take a feather here and cap off that top end. But before I do that, I want to make sure that I have all these bits of rubber kind of parted to the left and to the right, trying to make a flat top as well as a bottom on this. It's mostly good. Can work on the bottom after I get this top taken care of. So when it comes to the feather here, you don't need a super big one on that back. Just enough to cover it. And try to get one that's pretty evenly proportioned. You don't want one end super long, and you don't want too aggressive of a curve coming back like that, because then you're just going to fight it. So a relatively flat, symmetrical feather. And I'm doing this so the tips of that feather end up coming about flush with the ends of the Frenzy Fly brush in the back end. And that would be the sparkly of the brushes. Setting the stem right along the hook shank, centered along it. We then wrap it down. Once that feather is on there, you're going to take your flex resin and you're going to run a small amount right down the stem of the feather, and then just feather that amount out to the sides to help reinforce the rest of the feather. Go very thin, and if you think what you're doing is thin, go thinner. Tie that off. A little bit of super glue there. And then we're going to do just a little bit of trimming on the bottom of this fly. So earlier I'd mentioned how I like it to be a little bit flat. Just helps reduce drag, might give you a little better swim. At a minimum, it looks nicer. Training the rubber and the fibers out to either side. I'll then take my scissors and just make a flat cut. Kind of clean any junk out. This gives us a nice flat finish to the rear of this fly. Alright, so once you've finished the rear portion of the fly, we're going to move on to the front. So the front of the fly is a 25mm shank. If you want a time smaller, you can go down to a 20. Doesn't really matter. You might have to tweak a few things if you're going shorter than 25, but we'll just do a 25 today. So you just attach that hook directly to that rear open portion of the shank, just like that. Okay? It's going to hang like so. Once you have it secure in your vise, you'll go ahead and put a nice thread base down. So I can undo this mess here. A nice thread base down on the shank, closing that opening in the rear. Being careful not to slice yourself on that little edge. Go all the way up to the eye. And all the way back. Okay, I'll usually lay a little bit of extra thread down back there to ensure that everything's secure and there's no twisting. And I always try to make as complete of a thread base as possible, because this sets up the foundation for your materials to sit on. If you got big gaps of shank exposed there, it's just going to slip around it. So once our thread base is down and we're all the way in the rear, our next step is to create kind of another bump just like we did in the back. This one's just more about filling some gap, covering up that little gap. And it's Frenzy Fly brush again. And just like before, just, 2-3 wraps. Always taking care to keep that material brushed back and not in your way. Once that's lashed down, you can trim off the excess. And just keep preening all those fibers back. Get that out of your way for a clean start. With that down, we're going to go ahead and tie in our lively leg brush right away. Right in the back. But I'm going to leave it hang for now. And I'm going to lay down a little bit of super glue for good measure. And I'm going to create a little bit of a foundation here, just using thread, for a small rattle. You can choose not to use the rattle if you want. I'm going to go ahead and put it in. I'd say if you're using a 20 millimeter shank, you probably just go ahead and skip it. But on the 25s, you can sneak it in. Alright. And I build that foundation just to make it sit a little nicer. These are really small 2-bead glass rattles. Yep, these are 2-bead. And before I put the rattle on in there, I'm going to lay down a little bit of Loctite gel. This will not look pretty, but we're going to cover it up. And you won't even know it's there. You want that rattle to sit directly on top of the shank. It's kind of why I put that super glue on in the first place. It'll help secure it along with your thread wraps. The key when wrapping these things on is don't go super tight, because that's going to cause it to roll. You want to set it there and just get some, like a good number of looser wraps on there, and just slowly build tension as you go to prevent it from rolling. There. And just because I want to be a freak about it, go ahead and add some more super glue of the brushable variety. Cool. That's quite secure. And now you're going to wrap over that with your lively leg brush. Okay, this doesn't need to be super densely packed, just like before. Leaving some gaps between each wrap, taking the care to brush material rearward and out of the way. Then once you get to the end of your rattle there, just jump to the front of it, make a wrap or two, and tie it off. When we build out the final piece of the carapace, like we're about to do, all that's going to be covered up from view anyway. So just like I said, it doesn't really matter if it looks sloppy at this point. because it's getting covered. Just going through a little extra preening, make sure none of those rubber legs are trapped under there. Alright, for our carapace, I've got 3 feathers selected. And we went as close as possible to even sizes. And again, looking for more symmetrical feathers. So these are going to be my left and right flanks. Pretty dang close. Not too terribly off. And then this one's going to go over the very top. When you're building this carapace out, the first 2 steps are going to be the left and right flanks, so the side facing you and the side facing away. In terms of distance back, I want the tips of that feather to go past the tips of the frenzy fly brush on the front shank. So about to here. Just past. Okay, there's one. I'm going to rotate this towards me to do this side. There's 2. So you saw I just did a couple of loose wraps there. That's just to get it secured to the hook without rolling it. And now I'll make more wraps, slowly tightening with each subsequent wrap to secure these in and finish it off with some super glue. And then I'll add the top piece to complete the carapace. I trim these out of the way. There. So you got one trapped leg here. There. And now we're going to go over the top. And this feather just sits like a cap right over the top of everything, just like you did in the rear. And in terms of distance back, you're going to basically match it up with the tips of the first 2 feathers you put on. Just past the frenzy fly brush. Come on, buddy. This is the one that can give you fits. The top feather will have a tendency to want to roll. So you have to be gentle and careful. Once you get everything secured and resined in, it'll no longer matter. But up to that point, some gentle nudging and careful thread wraps are your friend. Just like the rear flank, I'm gonna just put thin layers of this resin down along each stem of each feather, and then with the top I'm going to brush that down the sides of the top feather down onto the sides of the either flank on the sides. This way I can fuse the 2 feathers together. I'm going to give this a quick look over. So that's not too shabby. There is a slight imperfection I'm going to clean up here. This is good for everyone to see. So sometimes, especially with these smaller ones, if the feathers don't perfectly line up, you can go ahead and add a fourth to fill that gap, but it needs to be pretty similar in size and tone to the rest of them. Okay, it doesn't really add any extra bulk to the fly. And I should say this doesn't need to be done, but it will create a nicer finish for us. Okay, so I had a gap between the top feather and the side facing out, and I just wanted to clean that. I'm going to do the exact same thing. Now that carrus is totally built, we're going to put in some rubber legs here. And I am just doing, on these small ones, about 3 legs per side. Okay, once those legs are locked in on the side there, I'm going to go ahead and put in just a little bit of super glue. I'm going to get ready to add a very short, thin layer of rabbit with a dubbing loop, just to help add a little bulk. Wax the dubbing loop. And we don't need or want a lot of rabbit in here because I still got to fit in the whole head. This is going to be 2, maybe 3 wraps. Once you get your rabbit cut off the hide, very carefully put it in that dubbing loop and take the time to spread it out a little and even up the tips as best you can. It needn't be perfect, but just good enough. Wire brush is your friend. Gotta eat some thread here. And I've got this right up against those mallard flank feathers where they started. And with each wrap, I'm trying to brush those rabbit fibers back because I'm trying my best not to lose much real estate on this hook. There we go. Once that's all tied off, make sure it's secure. Oh no. I've pushed back that rabbit. I've got just a small amount on there. Make sure our rubber's sitting correct. And then the last thing we're going to tie in is our crustaceous brush. This just has to be a handful of wraps. There is no magic number. It kind of depends on how much space you left yourself. With this one, it's probably going to be 2.5 before I do anything. Lock it in with glue. Don't be afraid with the brushable super glue. If you're going to spend this much time and effort on a fly, make sure everything stays together for the long run. Okay, this brush is thick and kind of unruly, so less is more, and you have to be especially attentive to what these fibers are doing. Brushing them back after each turn. This will help you greatly. There's one. There's two. This brush responds very well to the wire brush. And I'm going to stop there at about 2.5 wraps so I can tie this sucker off. Okay. Once you got it like that, you can go ahead and whip finish and get your thread out of the equation. We are almost done. Super glue that head to finish. And then we got to do some trimming and hit it with some more resin. At this point, see a lot of heads where people stop here, maybe cut exactly 3 fibers, and then go ahead and hit it with the resin. And they have way too much material left on there. What we're looking for is a pretty compact head, kind of like this finished version ends up being, if you can see that in contrast. Right? So I've got a fair amount of trimming that I have to end up doing to get that shape. Some nice long scissors help with this job. That first cut is going to be right along the bottom. I am going to take some other scissors with the pointy end and just make sure I got as much of the trap material picked out. It's worth looking over. If you look in there and you see that some material is like doubled over, almost like a little arch, you're going to want to pick that out. There we go. I think that was about all I had in there. Typically, to get the best cut that I can, I will rotate this towards me. And try to take the scissors and go flat along the bottom. Always being sure not to cut too far in and start taking out the rabbit that you spent so much time getting done. Looking for just a very flat bottom of this fly. Kind of like that. And then from there I'm going to go to work on the sides. And these cuts needn't be done in haste. Take your time, measure it up. And I am angling my scissors. It's not a perfectly straight cut relative to the center of the fly. I'm kind of canted off to the side. Okay, so now I'm like that. And then I'm going to start working on that top end. What I'm doing on this one, and you can experiment with your cuts, is I'm doing more of a rounded cut along the top end. Gives you a little bulkier finish. Glides instead of digs. And that's about all the trimming I'm going to dare to do on that. Because if I keep going, I'm going to over trim. But at this point, to fully finish it, take your flex resin, and again, can't stress this enough, light and thin applications. I'm barely squeezing the bottle, and I'm not touching the same place twice. If I do have to touch the same place twice, I'm not adding material, I'm spreading it. And often I'll turn the thing to the side or use a little teeny brush to distribute that back along the fibers that are there. Do the same thing on the bottom. Thin, thin, thin. And after you hit it with the light and cure that, you've got your fly. The Mini Fleein Cray.